Question 1. In a context of radiation protection, Mr. Thompson, a radiation worker, is working with a sealed radioactive source. He notices that the radiation dose rate increases as he moves close to the source. Based on the inverse square law, which of the following actions should Mr. Thompson take to minimize his exposure? A. Increase the exposure time to balance the dose rate. B. Wear thicker protective clothing to reduce exposure. C. Increase the distance between himself and the radioactive source. D. Move to a location where the dose rate is more uniform. Answer. Correct answer C. Explanation. The inverse square law states that the radiation dose decreases with the square of the distance from the source. Increasing the distance between the worker and the radioactive source reduces the exposure significantly. Wearing thicker clothing or increasing exposure time options. And B. Does not minimize radiation exposure effectively. The dose rate increases as you move closer to the source, so increasing distance is the best way. Protect oneself. This principle is fundamental in radiation protection and follows the ALARA as low as reasonably achievable principle. Question 2. What would happen if a radiation protection program failed to include regular calibration of survey meters and contamination monitors? A. The monitoring devices could fail to detect radiation, leading to potential overexposure. B. The radiation workers could be exposed to radiation levels far below safety limits. C. The ALARA principle would be compromised, causing non-compliance with regulations. D. The radiation exposure for both workers and the public would be effectively mitigated. Answer. Correct answer. A. Explanation. Regular calibration of survey meters and contamination monitors is crucial for ensuring the accuracy and reliability of radiation detection. Failure to calibrate these instruments may result in them failing to detect radiation, leading to potential overexposure and putting workers and the public at risk. Option B is incorrect because uncalibrated meters might underreport radiation levels, not prevent exposure. Option C refers to a broader regulatory issue, but calibration issues are more directly related to detection accuracy, not the ALARA principle per se. Option D is inaccurate because failure to calibrate would increase the risk of exposure, not mitigate it. Question 3. When considering the biological effects of radiation exposure, which of the following statements is true regarding stochastic effects? A. They occur with the threshold dose and their severity increases with dose. B. They are random and the probability of occurrence increases with dose, but the severity does not depend on the dose. C. They are associated with immediate damage and often result in acute radiation syndrome. D. They are a result of deterministic effects and have a predictable outcome based on the exposure level. Answer. Correct answer. B. Explanation. Stochastic effects are random in nature and their probability of occurrence increases with the dose, but their severity does not depend on the amount of radiation received. Common examples of stochastic effects include cancer and genetic mutations. These effects have no threshold, meaning they can occur even at very low doses, but the likelihood of occurrence increases with increasing dose. In contrast, deterministic effects. Option D have a threshold dose and their severity increases with the dose received. Question 4. Under the assumption that a radiation worker is exposed to a dose of 50 millisieverts (MSV) in a year, which of the following statements is correct according to the occupational dose limits established by the International Commission on Radiological Protection (ICOP)? A. The worker's exposure is within the recommended limits for radiation worker. B. The worker's exposure is above the recommended limit and the dose should be reduced immediately. C. The exposure is safe and does not need further monitoring. D. The worker is not exposed to significant risk due to the relatively low dose. Answer. Correct answer. A. Explanation. According to ICOP recommendations, the annual occupational dose limit for radiation workers is 50 MSV per year. A dose of 50 MSV is within the acceptable range for occupational exposure. It is crucial, however, to monitor and manage radiation exposure through regular dose assessments and control measures to adhere to the ALARA principle. A dose of 50 MSV is not immediately hazardous. Ongoing monitoring and protective measures should always be in place. Question 5. From a practical standpoint, how should radiation workers handle and store radioactive materials to ensure maximum safety? A. Radioactive materials should be stored in an open, well-ventilated space to allow free air circulation. B. Radioactive materials should be stored in sealed containers with appropriate shielding and in designated storage areas. C. Radioactive materials can be stored in any location as long as the area is kept clean. D. Radioactive materials should be handled with bare hands to minimize contamination risk. Answer. Correct answer. B. Explanation. Radioactive materials must be stored in sealed containers with appropriate shielding to minimize the risk of exposure and contamination. Designated storage areas ensure that materials are stored safely and in compliance with regulations. Option A is incorrect because open spaces do not provide adequate protection from radiation. Option C is not acceptable as uncontrolled storage areas increase the risk of accidents. Option D is unsafe as handling radioactive materials without proper protective equipment increases the risk of contamination and exposure. Question 6. Taking into account the effects of radiation on the cellular and molecular levels, which of the following is true regarding radiation-induced damage? A. Radiation primarily affects the structure of the DNA molecule, leading to mutations. B. The effects of radiation on cellular structures are negligible in the long term. C. The severity of radiation damage to cells is inversely proportional to the dose received. D. Radiation primarily affects non-living tissue such as bone and cartilage. Answer. Correct answer. A. Explanation. Radiation-induced damage primarily occurs at the molecular level, especially affecting DNA. This can lead to mutations, which may cause cancer or other genetic effects. Cellular damage from radiation is more significant at higher doses, and the damage is often irreversible. The effects on living tissue are critical, and the DNA molecule is particularly sensitive to ionizing radiation. Options B, C, and D do not accurately reflect the nature of radiation-induced biological damage. Question 7. Several experts suggest that the stochastic effects of radiation exposure, such as cancer, have a low threshold. Based on this, which of the following measures is most effective in minimizing risk? A. Reducing the duration of exposure to radiation as much as possible. B. Wearing a radiation dosimeter to monitor exposure levels. C. Increasing the dose rate to reduce the chance of stochastic effects. D. Providing frequent breaks during exposure to mitigate the effects. Answer. Correct answer. A. Explanation. The ELIRA principle suggests minimizing exposure time, distance, and shielding to reduce the risk of stochastic effects like cancer. Reducing the duration of exposure is particularly effective in minimizing cumulative radiation dose. Monitoring with dosimeters, option B, helps track exposure, but it does not reduce the risk directly. Increasing the dose rate, option C, would increase the risk of stochastic effects. Providing frequent breaks, option D, does not address the underlying issue of cumulative dose. Question 8. During a routine radiation safety audit, Mr. Daniels, a radiation safety officer, notices that a radiation facility's shielding calculations for a new X-ray machine are outdated. What should Mr. Daniels do to comply with current safety standards? A. Perform new shielding calculations based on the latest guidelines and regulations. B. Rely on the previous calculations since the X-ray machine has not changed. C. Discontinue the use of the X-ray machine until further notice. D. Ignore the outdated calculations if no immediate danger is apparent. Answer. Correct answer. A. Explanation. Mr. Daniels should ensure that shielding calculations are updated to reflect current standards and regulations. This is necessary to maintain compliance with radiation safety guidelines and to protect both workers and the public from excessive radiation exposure. The previous calculations, option B, may no longer be valid due to changes in equipment or safety standards. Discontinuing use, option C, may not be necessary, but updating the calculations is critical. Ignoring outdated calculations, option D, is unsafe and non-compliant with radiation safety protocols. Question 9. In a modern context of radiation therapy, which of the following strategies best minimizes patient exposure while ensuring effective treatment? A. Using the highest possible radiation dose to achieve faster treatment. B. Applying multiple imaging techniques to assess the patient's condition before treatment. C. Utilizing the most advanced imaging and treatment techniques to focus radiation precisely on the target. D. Reducing the frequency of follow-up imaging to minimize patient exposure. Answer. Correct answer. C. Explanation. In radiation therapy, precision is key to minimizing patient exposure while ensuring effective treatment. Advanced imaging techniques such as ET and MRI, combined with techniques like intensely modulated radiation therapy, help focus radiation precisely on the tumor, sparing surrounding healthy tissue. Using high doses, option A, or applying multiple imaging techniques, option B, could increase patient exposure, reducing follow-up imaging, option D, may compromise the accuracy of treatment monitoring. Question 10. In response to a radiological emergency, which of the following actions is the most appropriate for minimizing public exposure to radiation? A. Evacuate the area immediately without considering the level of radiation. B. Monitor radiation levels and issue shelter-in-place instructions if levels are below protective action guides. C. Continue normal activities while advising the public to wear protective clothing. D. Allow the public to self-monitor radiation exposure and leave at their discretion. Answer. Correct answer. B. Explanation. In a radiological emergency, it is critical to monitor radiation levels and take appropriate actions based on protective action guides (PAGs). If radiation levels are below these thresholds, sheltering in place is often the safest option. Immediate evacuation, option A, may not always be necessary and could cause chaos. Advising normal activities, option C, or allowing self-monitoring, option D, may the public to unnecessary risks if radiation levels are high. The correct response is to manage the situation according to established safety protocols. Question 11. When considering the use of shielding materials in a radiation facility, which of the following is the most effective way to reduce exposure to gamma radiation? A. Use of lead as the primary shielding material. B. Use of water as a shielding material. C. Use of concrete to provide shielding. D. Use of polyethylene as a shielding material. Answer. Correct answer. A. Explanation. Lead is the most effective material for shielding against gamma radiation due to its high density and atomic number, which help absorb gamma rays. Water and concrete are less effective compared to lead, though they can still provide some shielding for other types of radiation. Polyethylene, option D, is often used for neutron shielding, but it is not as effective for gamma radiation. Question 12. What is the primary purpose of personnel dosimetry devices, such as thermoluminescent dosimeters (TLDS) or optically stimulated luminescence oscillators? A. To measure the dose of radiation to the public during exposure. B. To monitor radiation exposure of individual workers over time. C. To ensure that radiation equipment is functioning properly. D. To calibrate radiation shielding materials. Answer. Correct answer. B. Explanation. Personnel dosimetry devices like TLDS and oscillators are used to monitor the cumulative radiation dose received by individual workers over time. This ensures that workers remain within the legal exposure limits and helps assess the effectiveness of radiation protection measures. They are not used to measure public exposure. Option A. Ensure equipment functionality. Option C. Or calibrate shielding material. Option D. Question 13. In a controlled radiation area, what is the primary regulatory requirement for maintaining safety for workers? A. Implementing continuous monitoring for radiation levels and keeping exposure within regulated limits. B. Allowing workers to enter and exit as they wish as long as they are wearing protective clothing. C. Limiting the use of radiation to certain times of the day to reduce cumulative exposure. D. Ensuring that all radiation sources are removed at the end of each workday. Answer. Correct answer. A. Explanation. The primary requirement for a controlled radiation area is continuous monitoring of radiation levels and ensuring that worker exposure remains within regulated limits. This is essential for protecting workers and ensuring compliance with radiation safety regulations. Option B does not address monitoring or exposure limits. Option C may not be practical or sufficient. And option D is not always feasible or necessary, as radiation sources are often required to remain during operational hours. Question 14. Considering radiation-induced carcinogenesis, which of the following best describes the dose-response relationship for cancer risk? A. Cancer risk increases linearly with dose with no safe threshold. B. The risk of cancer decreases significantly as the dose increases. C. Cancer risk is only significant at very high doses above the occupational exposure limits. D. The risk of cancer is independent of radiation dose. Answer. Correct answer, A. Explanation. Radiation-induced carcinogenesis follows a linear no-threshold model, meaning that any exposure to ionizing radiation increases the risk of cancer, with the risk increasing in proportion to the dose received. There is no safe threshold, so even low-level exposures contribute to cancer risk. Option B is incorrect, as high doses do not reduce cancer risk, and option C is also inaccurate because cancer risks can occur even at low occupational doses. Question 15. In light of recent developments, regulatory bodies like the ICOP and SRP emphasize the importance of the ALARA principle in radiation protection. What does ALARA stand for? A. As little as radiation is acceptable. B. As low as reasonably achievable. C. All levels of radiation are regulated adequately. D. Adequate limits for all radiation areas. Answer. Correct answer, B. Explanation. ALARA stands for as low as reasonably achievable and is a key principle in radiation protection. It encourages minimizing radiation exposure to workers and the public while still achieving the intended outcomes of the work, balancing safety with practicality. Option A is incorrect as it does not accurately describe ALARA. Option C and D do not reflect the intention of minimizing radiation exposure to the lowest possible level. Question 16. In the context of occupational radiation safety, what is the primary role of the Radiation Safety Officer or SO in ensuring regulatory compliance? A. To perform the daily operations of the radiation equipment. B. To oversee the implementation of radiation protection policies and monitor compliance with regulations. C. To handle the calibration and repair of radiation detection equipment. D. To train workers on using personal protective equipment only. Answer. Correct answer, B. Explanation. The Radiation Safety Officer, or SO, is responsible for overseeing the implementation of radiation protection policies and ensuring compliance with regulations. This includes monitoring radiation levels, conducting safety audits, and ensuring that radiation safety practices are followed, while the RSO may oversee training. Option D, and ensure equipment is in proper working order. Option C, their prime role, compliance oversight. Question 17. What is the key distinction between deterministic and stochastic radiation effects? A. Deterministic effects occur with a threshold dose, while stochastic effects have no threshold. B. Stochastic effects are more predictable than deterministic effects. C. Deterministic effects only occur in cancerous tissues, while stochastic effects occur in all tissues. D. Stochastic effects result in immediate symptoms, while deterministic effects appear after a prolonged period. Answer. Correct answer, A. Explanation. Deterministic effects, such as radiation burns or acute radiation syndrome, occur above a threshold dose and their severity increases with dose. Stochastic effects, like cancer, have no threshold and their probability increases with dose, but the severity does not depend on the dose. Option B is incorrect, as stochastic effects are not necessarily more predictable than deterministic effects. Option C and D both misrepresent the nature of these two types of effects. Question 18. During the process of decontaminating a facility after radiological incident, which of the following is the most effective initial step? A. Use of high-pressure water jets to wash down all surfaces in the affected area. B. Immediate evacuation of all personnel from the contaminated area without further action. C. Assessment of contamination levels using radiation survey meters before initiating cleanup. D. Removal of all contaminated equipment without conducting a detailed assessment. Answer. Correct answer, C. Explanation. The most effective initial step in decontamination is to assess the contamination levels using radiation survey meters. This ensures that cleanup efforts are focused where they are most needed and that radiation safety measures are followed. Simply using high-pressure water jets, option A, without knowing the extent of contamination may spread radioactive materials further. Option B and D are incorrect because proper assessment is necessary before evacuation or equipment removal. Question 19. Which of the following is an essential aspect of radiation protection training for workers in a radiological environment? A. Ensuring workers wear personal protective equipment at all times, even when exposure is minimal. B. Educating workers on the use of shielding and the importance of time and distance in minimizing exposure. C. Focusing solely on the use of radiation detection instruments without addressing other aspects of radiation safety. D. Providing workers with the most advanced radiation exposure monitoring technology without training on its correct use. Answer. Correct answer. B. Explanation. Radiation protection training should focus on key principles such as the use of shielding and the importance of time and distance in minimizing exposure. Workers need to understand how to implement the ALARA principle in their daily work. Option A may not be necessary in all situations, as exposure could be minimal in some cases. Option C is too narrow, and option D is ineffective without training on proper use. Question 20. What is the significance of public dose limits in radiation protection regulations? A. They ensure that radiation exposure to the public does not exceed levels that could cause immediate health effects. B. They are only applicable to areas where radioactive materials are being used for research purposes. C. They serve as a guideline for determining how much radiation can be emitted from medical devices and facilities. D. They aim to minimize radiation exposure from both natural and artificial sources to the general public. Answer. Correct answer. D. Explanation. Public dose limits are designed to minimize radiation exposure to the general public from both natural and artificial sources, ensuring that radiation does not exceed safe levels. These limits are a key part of maintaining radiation safety for non-occupational populations. Option A is incorrect because public dose limits are primarily about minimizing long-term risk, not preventing immediate health effects. Option B and C are more specific to certain scenarios and do not reflect the broader application of public dose limits. Question 21. In the context of radiation protection, which of the following is the most effective way to minimize radiation exposure to personnel working with ionizing radiation? A. Increase the amount of time spent in radiation areas. B. Reduce the distance between personnel and the radiation source. C. Maximize the use of appropriate shielding materials. D. Ensure that workers are exposed to radiation only during night shifts. Answer. Correct answer. C. Explanation. The most effective way to minimize radiation exposure is to maximize the use of appropriate shielding materials, such as lead or concrete, which absorb radiation and protect workers. While reducing time and increasing distance are also important factors, shielding is the most direct and effective method. Option A would increase exposure, option B would bring workers closer to the radiation source, and option D is not a reliable method for reducing exposure. Question 22. Which of the following is true regarding the occupational exposure limits for radiation workers as set by regulatory bodies such as the SRP and ICAP? A. There is no limit to the occupational radiation dose for radiation workers. B. Occupational exposure limits are designed to ensure that radiation workers do not receive doses above levels that could result in acute health effects. C. The dose limits for radiation workers are the same for all types of radiation. D. Occupational dose limits are based on the premise of minimizing risk while considering the benefits of radiation work. Answer. Correct answer. D. Explanation. Occupational dose limits are established with the goal of minimizing the risk of harmful effects while balancing the benefits of radiation use. These limits are not designed to prevent acute health effects, but to reduce long-term risks, particularly cancer. Option A is incorrect because limits are set. Option B misrepresents the goal of these limits, which focus on long-term health rather than acute effects. Option C is incorrect because different radiation types require different considerations in terms of dose limits. Question 23. In the event of a radiological emergency, which of the following actions should be prioritized to protect public health? A. Immediate evacuation of individuals to a location where radiation levels are guaranteed to be zero. B. Providing adequate information to the public and ensuring that protective actions are taken, such as sheltering in place or evacuation as needed. C. Allowing individuals to continue normal activities while issuing warnings about the radiation incident. D. Only providing protective action guides to government officials, not the public. Answer. Correct answer B. Explanation. In a radiological emergency, the primary concern is to provide adequate information to the public and implement protective actions such as sheltering in place, evacuation, or distribution of iodine tablets if needed. It is crucial to guide the public on how to respond based on radiation levels. Immediate evacuation to a radiation-free area, option A, is not always possible, and option C, jeopardize public safety. Option D, would hinder the effectiveness of public protection measures. Question 24. What is the purpose of radiation shielding calculations in radiation protection? A. To determine the precise location of radiation sources within a facility. B. To calculate the appropriate thickness and type of shielding materials to reduce radiation exposure to acceptable levels. C. To monitor the levels of radiation emissions from medical equipment. D. To estimate the economic cost of implementing radiation safety measures. Answer. Correct answer B. Explanation. Radiation shielding calculations are performed to determine the appropriate thickness and type of shielding materials that will reduce radiation exposure to acceptable levels. These calculations take into account the type of radiation, its energy, and the expected exposure levels. Option A focuses on source placement, which is important but not the primary purpose of shielding calculations. Option C is about monitoring, not shielding, and option D is not directly related to radiation safety calculations. Question 25. When considering the biological effects of radiation, which of the following statements about stochastic effects is true? A. Stochastic effects occur only at very high doses of radiation above the threshold limit. B. The severity of stochastic effects increases with the radiation dose received. C. Stochastic effects have a known threshold and are predictable. D. Stochastic effects, such as cancer, have no threshold and their probability increases with dose but not severity. Answer. Correct answer D. Explanation. Stochastic effects, such as cancer, have no threshold, meaning that any dose of radiation can increase the probability of these effects occurring, although the severity does not increase with higher doses. The probability increases with dose, but the severity remains the same. Option A is incorrect because stochastic effects can occur at any dose level. Option B is incorrect because the severity does not depend on the dose. Option C is also incorrect as stochastic effects are not predictable in terms of severity. Question 26. In a research facility where radioactive materials are handled, what is a key safety measure to prevent radiation contamination? A. Strictly limiting the amount of radioactive material used in each experiment. B. Ensuring that all personnel wear lead aprons at all times. C. Conducting regular surveys using contamination monitors to detect radioactive particles. D. Only using radiation enclosed systems to avoid any potential exposure. Answer. Correct answer C. Explanation. Regular surveys using contamination monitors are essential for detecting radioactive particles and preventing the spread of contamination, while limiting radioactive material, option A, and using closed systems, option D, can help monitoring contamination is crucial to ensuring the safety of the work environment. Option B is not a sufficient measure as lead aprons are not effective for all types of radiation. Question 27. Under the assumption that radiation exposure is accidental, what is the primary goal of radiation exposure assessment in emergency medical management? A. To immediately reduce the exposure to zero for all affected individuals. B. To determine the total dose of radiation received and evaluate the potential risk for acute radiation syndrome (ARS). C. To treat all affected individuals with radiation therapy to mitigate symptoms. D. To restrict all individuals' access to medical care until radiation levels subside. Answer. Correct answer. B. Explanation. The primary goal of radiation exposure assessment in emergency medical management is to determine the total dose of radiation received and evaluate the potential for acute radiation syndrome (ARS) or other radiation-related health effects. This allows for appropriate medical intervention and monitoring. Option A is not practical as zero exposure may not be achievable. Option C is incorrect as radiation therapy is not used to treat radiation exposure, it's used to treat cancer. Option D would delay care unnecessarily. Question 20. What is the primary purpose of regulatory compliance checks in a radiation safety program? A. To ensure that workers receive a sufficient amount of radiation exposure for training purposes. B. To verify that all radiation sources are functioning optimally. C. To ensure that radiation protection measures and protocols are being followed and that exposure levels are kept within limits. D. To monitor the financial performance of radiation protection measures. Answer. Correct answer. C. Explanation. Regulatory compliance checks are carried out to ensure that radiation protection measures are being followed, that exposure levels remain within regulatory limits, and that all safety protocols are adhered to. These checks are an essential part of maintaining a safe radiation environment. Option A is incorrect because training should not involve unnecessary exposure. Option B is focused on equipment but does not address overall safety. Option D is unrelated to radiation safety compliance. Question 29. In the context of radioactive waste disposal, which of the following is the most critical factor in determining the proper disposal method? A. The physical state of the radioactive waste, solid, liquid, or gas. B. The geographical location of the disposal site. C. The half-life and activity level of the radioactive material. D. The cost of disposal compared to other methods. Answer. Correct answer. C. Explanation. The half-life and activity level of the radioactive material are the most critical factors in determining the proper disposal method. These factors influence the potential for radiation exposure over time and determine the need for long-term monitoring. Option A and Option B are important considerations but are secondary to the radiological properties of the material. Option D should not be the determining factor in waste disposal as safety is the primary concern. Question 30. Which of the following radiation protection measures is most effective in a situation where personnel are exposed to neutron radiation? A. Using concrete as the primary shielding material. B. Increasing the distance between the radiation source and workers. C. Using polyethylene as a shielding material. D. Wearing lead aprons to block the radiation. Answer. Correct answer. C. Explanation. Polyethylene is the most effective material for shielding against neutron radiation due to its high hydrogen content, which effectively absorbs neutrons. Concrete, option A, can provide some shielding, but polyethylene is preferred for neutrons. Increasing distance, option B, is important but less effective compared to using proper shielding. Lead aprons, option D, are more suitable for photon-like radiation, not neutrons.